Philosophy and politics, and no Khogali, Conservative councillor for Strather. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning. How are you?
Morning.
Do you know what a teasmate is?
Not a clue. It sounds like a kettle that you have like next to your bed.
Good, yes.
And I'm assuming that you just put the tea bag in at the day before and then hope. Oh,
no. So it's an extraordinary device. I'll show you a picture in just a minute, but essentially you used to wake up, you set the timer, and some people still have them, you set the timer and the water then boils and you wake to hear this boiling water, and then there were two things. So there was kind of a kettle-y thing, and then it went into a teapot and it made you a cup of tea. But you have to be a certain age.
Feels like a lot of effort.
It was a lot of it was a huge amount of effort. I still have one in the attic somewhere, and also a trouser press, which basically you called a what?
It's basically a toaster, but for your trousers.
It's a
big
toaster
iron.
for your trousers. Do you know what that is, a trouser press?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very old invention indeed. Let's move on and talk about lots of politics, shall we? Because Keir Starmer, and we've talked. Let me just show you a tease made very quickly, if we can, because this is important for your education. There we are. That's a tease made. Can you see that? So, as you say, a lot of effort there. So a kettle-y thing that goes into a teapot thing. My parents loved a tease made.
It's way less cool than I thought it would look.
It's not cool at all. Anyway, we're talking about Keir Starmer setting the scene. I've been asking how much longer can you expect to stay or afford to stay in the United Kingdom. A sense of trepidation, really, as we approach this budget. I said it's a bit like walking along a diving board, on a high diving board, not quite knowing what's about to unfurl. But let's just talk about Keir Starmer gave his first interview. He talked about the NHS, and he pointedly said the NHS in England has been broken by successive Conservative-led governments, and it is now in a state that is unforgivable. Now, we've got Wes Streeting being quite quiet about this. Aradazi, who used to teach me, actually. I work for Aradazi, and I can say a few things, which I won't. But just in terms of that, he is blaming the state of the NHS fairly and squarely on the Conservative Party. I think that's a bit disingenuous when Tony Blair brought in PFI, lumbering the NHS with huge contracts. We still haven't paid off those hospitals, and actually they're not fit for purpose.
Yeah, the massive frustration for me, I think, is that my one glimmer of hope as we went into the last election where Labour actually made kind of sounds like they were going to be serious about NHS reform and have a proper adult conversation. And they've got into government, and immediately it's been clear that they had no ideas whatsoever from the beginning, and it has basically just been a mudslinging battle back over their shoulder at the Conservatives without any actual solutions being talked about. This is, you know, successive Conservative governments ploughed huge amounts of money into the NHS. Did it solve the fundamental problems? No. So we need to have a conversation about how to do that. And that's probably a European, a hybrid model.
Very interesting. Your thoughts on that?
So I slightly agree with you. I feel like before the election they were actually making realistic noises. I think Wes Streeting is someone who's thinking quite seriously and deeply about how the NHS needs reform. I do think it's a shame that they've resulted into sort of mudslinging against the Conservatives. They're now in power. I think the sort of constant attempt to set the narrative about the past 10 years, the past 14 years of government, needs to stop, and they need to start having some real adult conversations about how we're going to reform the NHS, because it's not a party political issue. This is, an issue that affects everyone, and it's an issue that's always going to be there.
And that's a great point, actually. Is it time to depoliticise the NHS? Because it seems to me it is being used to play tennis between two major parties. And actually, the problem is intractable. You have an increasingly ageing population, people with more needs. We're offering more at more expensive cost. And frankly, we can't afford it.
Yeah, I'd agree. I just think it needs to become a sort of totally non-political, technocratic conversation about how are we going to develop this institution going into the future.
What do you think is the solution here? You mentioned a hybrid model, but when you look at the numbers of doctors, for example, only 123,000 doctors, 8,800 doctors are going to leave that service. To be fair to the Conservative government, they are at least doubling the number, or they were doubling the number of medical school places, which I think is very welcome. We need to keep people in this country, keep them in the NHS, treat doctors and nurses properly, making sure that they actually have places to change, for example, and have hot meals, which isn't happening at the moment. When you mention a hybrid model, what do you think the solution is then?
We need to look at what's working elsewhere in the world, not bury our heads in the sand and go, look, we all appreciate the healthcare we receive, but that doesn't mean that it always needs to stay within that structure of, the NHS. The NHS as an idea has, had a long, long legacy of, benefits for people up and down the country. But we're in, a different time now with different demographics that exist in our country. So I think it was Sajid Javid that suggested potentially having a royal commission to try and depoliticise the issue and have a proper conversation. But as long as it's an effective attack route for Labour, to turn around and talk about Conservative governments or Conservative oppositions, we'll never do that because there's no incentive for them really to solve the issue.
And here we go again, and your point was very valid, which is that they are still acting as though they're in opposition, blaming the previous Conservative governments. At some point, you actually have to say we're in charge. Now, we're 2 months in. At what point are they going to do that? I mean, these figures are absolutely terrible. 100,000 infants left waiting for more than 6 hours in A&E. Wait times for infants rose 60%. 800,000 children and young people on NHS waiting lists for hospital treatment. 175,000 waiting between 6 and 12 months. But at the same time, you're taking away the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. You're now talking about getting rid of the single-person discount. These are all active decisions by this Labour government. At the same time, and I will mention this, Ed Miliband's potty plan to get us to net zero by 2030, apparently going to cost £300 billion. These are political choices.
I don't feel the same way as you. I think the NHS, the way we're going to reform our energy sector and how we're going to move towards renewable energy, these are some the issues of our time. They're not political issues in the way we're thinking about them. I understand there's big sums of money associated with this. Huge sums of money.
In fact, we don't know how much it is.
But that change is going to come at one point, whether anyone likes it or not. Because
why is it?
Because you can't burn fossil fuels indefinitely.
Why not?
Because there's not an infinite amount of fossil fuels in the ground. So it's going to come.
We've got trillions of pounds of natural treasure sitting under our feet, and even the unions are objecting to the loss of fossil fuels.
Trillions of pounds of assets that you have to sell on the international market. So you're still vulnerable to fluxes in the pricing.
We're still vulnerable to wind, for example, because it doesn't blow sometimes.
I think the more you invest in renewable energy, this is a race that's taking place whether anyone likes it or not. If you go around the world, there's a lot of chat about China and India polluting more than us. They're also investing a lot more in renewable energy. China's looking to win this race. They're building electric cars, they're building solar panels, they're building wind, they're selling them to us.
Yes.
We need to get involved, otherwise you just stick your head in the sand, as you said earlier.
But is there a mandate for this? Fine, I understand that if that's where you want to go. Is there a mandate? Is that what the British people want? Has anyone actually asked the British people?
They voted for that in the election.
Did they?
Yeah, I think that was one of the key pledges of Labour.
Well, I think it was stuck there at the bottom.
I disagree.
Okay.
I think, that's totally not how I feel.
I think the alarm bells for me are over the sounds of Ed Miliband rolling back on nuclear. That's the big fear now for me. I think anything else is kind of, it's happening on the edges. The big thing that is going to ensure our long-term energy security and availability, so grid reinforcement and other things like that come alongside this, but we need to ensure that we have, a good supply of nuclear energy to this country.
I would agree totally with that, would you?
Yeah, I'd agree. And weirdly, it's one of those sort of paradoxes that you get Conservatives in favour of nuclear and more infrastructure, and you get Labour also in favour of more green renewable energy. Yet there seems to be this sort of shakiness about should we build it or not.
But in many ways, there's parallels between that and the health service, because we need to depoliticise the energy sector as well. We need to have a 20, 30, 40-year plan to ensure that we do actually build the SMRs or whatever they are. At the moment, you've got successive governments coming in, dilly-dallying around, and as usual, we get no infrastructure built.
Yeah, I just think build it.
I would agree.
Just build it.
Just build it. Same with aviation, for example.
Yeah, and that's the reality. I think Labour do have an opportunity, because they've got so many seats up and down the country, that they probably won't win again. If they turn around to those MPs and go, look, we're going to build it, you're going to be a one-term MP, realistically. We're going to build it in your constituency, and we're going to build it in, constituencies of Conservative MPs we want to target as well. There is an opportunity for us to build a lot more infrastructure. Labour just have to be brave and risk upsetting their own MPs.
And let's just talk about some other policies. And I asked various people this morning whether Labour has actually bitten off more than they can chew. And one of those things is adding VAT to private schools. There's been outcry about this because it's believed that something like 40,000 children will leave private schools. And we saw yesterday the case of one local authority saying to parents who are deeply worried they can't afford to send their kids to independent school, you have to prove you're not wealthy enough to send your kids to those schools. Now, there's a new story, a new angle on it this morning. Labour's plan to impose VAT on private school fees in January faces a High Court legal challenge because the claims are it breaches human rights laws. It's very clever. John Rentoul said it was a very clever wheeze, this. The letter says special education on needs and disabilities children risk being forced out of private schools if their parents can't afford higher fees because the state sector will be unable to meet their more demanding educational needs. Essentially what they're saying is it breaches their human rights. Do you think the Labour government, I mean, this is ideology, isn't it, rather than actually a coherent policy?
I agree. I think they haven't thought this one through properly because that angle is so politically damaging. They haven't thought about the special needs issue. I mean, on private schools in general, I did think there needed to be a reckoning because I think some private schools in this country can't pretend that they're behaving like charities. If you look at the investment they're making in sort of not profit-making, but big school, they're building big schools abroad in places like Egypt and China. These are very, very, very wealthy institutions.
But you're talking about a minority of very high-end private schools. The majority of those are the independent schools and not those schools.
Yeah, I'd agree. And that's where I think Labour have made a mistake, because they've looked at the political game.
Do you think they'll capitulate?
I'd be interested to see how this legal challenge progresses. Because if the government gets stuck in a long, old, drawn-out fight about this over the education of children with special needs, that's going to be damaging for them.
Noah?
Yeah, there may be a partial rollback, I think, for schools which can prove that they're doing a huge amount of special educational needs work. They might then roll back on that. And that actually wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if it encourages more, especially, you know, independent schools to do more for special educational needs. That would actually be a benefit, despite this being, you know, a politics of envy policy that is just designed to hurt, you know, a certain class of people. It provides no benefit to the state sector.
Well, and also there aren't the places in the state sector, so the fundamentals are that there is nowhere for these children to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a wider frustration and anger that I have about Labour's, you know, rhetoric about education. That is one area where basically everybody politically agrees the country had got so much better over the past decade, especially when you look at international rankings. And Labour basically agreed with that, then got into government, were like, this is terrible. No, it's not. That's quite a blatant lie.
Can I just ask you finally, before we go to the break, just in terms of that, and I said right at the beginning that people are standing there on the diving board just waiting to see what is happening in terms of the budget. Is it a case that actually they're painting such a bleak picture that anything that is better than that, people will actually think, well, this is a win, they're not that bad?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think they're working hard and they're thinking hard about how to set the narrative. And I think they're kind of copying the coalition government in that, because they set the narrative about what came before them very well. And Labour paint the picture of what we've had for the last 14 years and keep on repainting it. Eventually we're going to take any policy they give us. But I slightly disagree with you. I think they have been thinking hard about what they want to do.
Do you? Noah?
Labour have obviously just come in and are just saying the most, you know, out of this world things possible. This is the worst economic, you know,
22 billion
ever. Complete nonsense. That's what we've got at the moment. I think they're devoid of ideas and they are just treading water at the moment, trying to get to the autumn and then going to try and balance, you know, those left-wing MPs against their further right MPs.
I just think that's too harsh of a characterisation. This is a party that was serious about being in power for a long time. They knew and they felt they were going to win this general election for years. They're doing the political work now.
But don't tell me they didn't know about the fiscal hole, if that fiscal hole exists. And the more you repeat that mantra, the more you believe it, even if it's not believable.
I'm not saying that. But I am saying they knew what they were doing before, which is sort of agreeing with what you're saying. They're laying the political groundwork for that now, and then they're going to bring the tax rises that they want. And they've always wanted.
Indeed. Gentlemen, stay where you are. We'll continue our Future Politics panel after this break. This is Weekend Breakfast. Good morning.
This is Talk.
It certainly is. We're in the middle of Future Politics panel. I'm joined by William Barclay and Noah Khogali. Right, let's talk about Charlie Mullins. Bizarrely, I was actually with him the other night at a rather fun function. But Charlie Mullins, founder of Pimlico Plumbers, sold it for 140 million quid. He says he's off. He's off to Marbella. He's deeply nervous about the amount of tax that is coming down the line. Lots of other millionaires also disappearing, according to some of the people who are relocating them. 4,200 millionaires in the first 5 months of this year. 5,300 more are set to go. I think this is a problem for the Labour Party, again, ill thought through. And the function I mentioned was a fundraiser for Reform UK. And there is an article in the Times this morning saying that Farage is very serious about getting into government at the next election. This was hosted by Holly Valance and her husband Nick Candy the other night. The democratisation of that party is in full flow. The fact is they're getting local branches and getting candidates. They're going to field people at the local elections as well. How worried should the Conservatives be about the rise of reform?
Minimally, I think. It's a reality of the political system that we're in at the moment, in the same way as UKIP
4
was
million
for
votes.
Brexit was for, and this is a reality. It doesn't help to look outside of your own party and then focus more on trying to grab people backwards than it does on retain those voters.
No, I
first.
understand
That's
that, and the Conservative Party actually need to focus on themselves and actually decide what it is to be Conservative. But you don't think there's any threat from reform?
That's not what I'm saying. The same way there's threat from Labour and the Lib Dems. It's not just reform. The reality is that we lost votes to everybody last time, and it is important that we win them back from everyone as much as we can without destroying the party as it is now as well.
William?
Yeah, I agree. I think reform, it's a fact of Western democracies now that you're going to get stronger, not more extreme, but a stronger right-wing party, stronger people on the left. The Conservatives need to work out how to govern well and effectively.
So, but you're telling me that actually they've almost got a divine right to exist, then, the Conservatives?
I'm saying that in a sort of
Is that what
cringy
you're
way,
saying?
the solution in this democracy will always exist in the centre, and reform are not in the centre.
Well, that's very interesting, actually. I think they are centre-right. I don't think they're far-right. I think that's lazy journalism.
No, that's not at all what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm saying that the solution, like any policy solution, is always going to come through compromise and through the centre. Reform don't represent that right now. They represent the concerns, the legitimate concerns of 4 million voters, you're right. But they don't represent the policy solutions to those problems, I don't think.
Well, don't you think that actually, because people are so worried about the Labour Party, they want an effective opposition, they don't see that with the Conservative Party, and therefore they're looking for something else?
And the challenge for reform is going to be that when the Tories have a new leader, the comms are going to come out very loud and clear that if you voted for reform in a lot of these constituencies, the end result was that you got a Labour MP. That's the reality, and that's going to be the comms that comes out of the Conservative Party when we come closer to the next election.
Well, we shall see, we shall see. Let's just talk about the BBC, because I had the great pleasure of working for the BBC for a long time, but the BBC has breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times during the height of the Israel-Hamas war. It's an incredibly damning report, this. It shows a deeply worrying pattern of bias against Israel. They looked at 4 months of the BBC's output across television, radio, online, news, podcasts and social media. Danny Cohen, a former BBC executive, warned there was now an institutional crisis at the national broadcaster. Lots of people have been very concerned about the reporting from the BBC, and certainly some of the correspondents using language that I think is quite inflammatory. Also, the way that the BBC refused to call Hamas a terrorist organisation, they then used sort of phraseology to get around it. How much can we trust the BBC? This is a damning report.
I think the BBC... So I trust the BBC, and I understand on an issue
even given this report?
Yeah, because on an issue like Israel-Gaza, I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I think you are always going to get it wrong in one way or another, because it's just so contentious and feelings are so high about it, rightly. I don't think the BBC could... And also, I think these editorial guidelines, the BBC writes them themselves. I mean, how sort of objective and binary are they? You had the issue with Gary Lineker.
Well, I think they're fairly clear. Editorial policy is very, very clear, which is you have to be unbiased in your coverage.
But what does that constitute? I mean, what, like...
But if you're writing your own editorial policy and you're breaching your own editorial policy, that's a failure, an institutional failure, isn't it?
But I don't think I think the report says that. I don't think the BBC themselves think that.
No.
The challenge that we've got is for a long time, especially in this country, we did see the BBC as just completely infallible.
We did.
And in today's day and age, the access to information we all have, we don't see anyone as infallible. And that's just the reality. A huge amount of respect for the BBC, especially BBC World Service, which I think does a huge amount of good, and any cuts to that are damaging to our role in the world. Regardless of that, the BBC should be trusted as much as any other news organisation. Don't take your news from one source. You learn that when you're about 11.
I think the real concern for me is the BBC has to remain impartial because, and particularly with online news outlets, it's incredibly difficult to see which is the unbiased news and which is biased news. And this does the BBC no favours at all, and this is a pretty comprehensive report. I do think the BBC have questions to answer.
I think they're always going to have questions to answer. I agree with they're a service, and we've always got to demand more from the BBC, but I don't like this sort of constant trashing of it. It's something that I do think there are people there who are trying to do the right thing and trying to report on the issues.
Oh, 100%. I have friends who work at the BBC, but I do think there is an institutional failing, and I think standards have slipped.
The interesting, almost start for this modern iteration of this issue was during Brexit, where the BBC quite plainly couldn't work out whether balance meant giving, equal opportunity to speak to both sides of the argument, or meant them to make a judgment about what was a legitimate argument and what wasn't. That was, the beginning of this most modern iteration of this problem, and it's one that they've not really got on top of yet, I don't think.
Just very quickly, I want to ask you about pubs, because we're seeing all the rural pubs closing down. You know what I'm going to ask you, but the rural pubs closing down, it's incredibly difficult for these little pubs to make any money. We've talked about young people not going out, not drinking. Well, apparently, the mega pub is in. This is extraordinary. This is JD Wetherspoon. It's 5,000 square foot pub. The Lion and Unicorn is cavernous. There are huge kind of what they're calling mega pubs opening, like Brewdog in Waterloo, where they've got co-working spaces, an indoor slide and a bowling alley. But if you're drinking in a kind of aircraft hangar, is that really where you want to hang out?
I mean, I'm a big fan of Wetherspoons, but I agree, it's sad to see the countryside pub go. It's sad to hear that the Labour are trying to ban smoking outdoors. I think that's going to be one of the things that kills the pub and brings in these sort of massive corporatised mega pubs.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the numbers of pints, the venue served 900,000 pints of beer and cider last year and almost 500,000 meals and 136,000 coffees. The local pub can't compete. How do we keep local pubs going?
I think you have to both be appreciative of, the reality of someone like Wetherspoons or Brewdog. They have a huge amount of financial might behind them. But you've got to ask the people that are going to these pubs, what do you want? And ultimately, I prefer the smaller pub where, it's all cosy and old
Young
school.
people don't go.
No, I definitely go to the pub.
Oh,
it's all right.
You
don't
definitely
worry.
go. Do you
I'm
go?
doing my bit.
Yeah, I definitely go.
Oh, OK, fine. You both go. So that's the end of my
so
argument.
doing my bit.
Well done, you're doing your bit.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. William Barclay, undergraduate student of philosophy and politics now at Khogali, Conservative councillor for Strathclyde.